Happy Easter, everyone. Whether you celebrate it or not, holidays are a great excuse to get together or at least eat some quality food. So hopefully you had the chance to do one or the other, but ideally both. Most of us identify Easter as the most important Christian holiday, although I think we can all agree that Christmas is objectively better. Chances are that you're familiar with the story of Easter. However, if you're like me, you have no idea how some of the Easter traditions became a thing, and apparently it's kind of a mystery. No one really knows how the Easter bunny or eggs came into the conversation when it came to Easter. However, one theory is that it came from a pagan tradition where they celebrated fertility, whose symbol happened to be a rabbit. Another is that German immigrants brought over a rabbit that could lay chocolate eggs. And the excitement that this generated helped contribute to the spread of a tradition of putting out carrots for their Osterhare in the same way that you would prepare cookies for Santa. Whatever it means to you, my hope is that at least that means that chocolate is in your future. Today's guest is Rabbi Mordecai Finley. Yes, I do realize the irony of having a rabbi featured in the Easter episode, by the way. But in this episode, we spent some time discussing how to think differently and what we can do to improve the interpersonal relationships in our lives. And so I think the idea of a rebirth actually fits into the theme of this episode. Rabbi Finley is the founder of the Or HaTorah Synagogue, where he serves as a rabbi. He also has a counseling practice where he focuses on teaching wisdom, virtue, and how to manage your own consciousness. And if that wasn't enough, he's also a Marine veteran, has a PhD in religion and social ethics from USC, and is the only known rabbi who also happens to be a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So this guy is quintessentially a badass, which as a rabbi, I hope he doesn't mind me referring to him that way because it's just true. This is a guy who's spent his entire life exploring the nature of consciousness and how we can live better lives by understanding it. And he's also just brimming with wisdom. So I'm so happy that he agreed to join me, but I don't want to spoil it. Here's the episode. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Rabbi Finley, I'm so excited to have you here. Like I mentioned before we started talking, I've consumed
really excited to be here, Johnny.
Thank you. We really appreciate your time. So I guess to start things off, maybe a pretty interesting way to start would be just to hear about, your story, how you kind of got started on this path to exploring the human soul and human consciousness.
Sure. Well, I was always a thoughtful kid. I read philosophy and history as elementary school and middle school. When I was in high school, my science teacher was actually a spiritual teacher. I discovered later that he would select a few kids from each class and offer them to become their spiritual teacher. So he selected me when he would give his lectures in science class, he would now and then ask, he'd make a point and then look right at me. So for example, I just remember vaguely, this might not be exactly a quote, but something like, people used to believe that, that bacteria began as spontaneous generation. And he looked at me and say something like, but we all know things come from mystical realms, something like that, where he would, the origins of things and unseen realms. And he looked right at me and I look around and ask myself, is he looking at me? So one day after class, I came to him, his name was Jack Bishop. I said, Mr. Bishop, sometimes you ask questions or say things, I feel you're looking right at me. And he said, I was wondering when you were going to come and ask me about it. And I said, what's up? And he shared with me, he said, I think I have something to teach you. And we talked a little bit. Now, remember, I already read, in 9th, 10th grade, existentialism and Sartre and Camus. So I knew what was going on, I think, in the inner life, philosophic, spiritual realm. And so when he offered this to me to come to Science 105, I think it was at 3:00 on Wednesday afternoons or something, I went over there and we began a journey into what I would call consciousness. It turns out later I discovered that he was a firm follower in a very specific spiritual school. I didn't know it until later when I had broadened my knowledge of spirituality, but he was my teacher all throughout 11th grade, all throughout 12th grade. And from that, I had a sense of the possibilities of the human being, possibilities of human potential, and where I was living at the time, Linwood High School, 1973 is when I graduated. I just felt I wasn't worthy, that I couldn't discipline myself enough to live according to what I'd been taught and brought into. So that's when I joined the military for many reasons, including I'm a patriot and I wanted the GI Bill. But one of the reasons was for kind of a spiritual discipline and purification. And that, going into the military was part of a very conscious path toward spirituality, depth, mysticism, consciousness. And then that, as I went through life, that's taken on many, many other forms as well. But it really goes all the way back to, I would say, my natural proclivities as a young person. And then there's almost a miraculous intervention of my high school teacher, Jack Bishop.
Got it. Well, thank you for that summary. I'm sure that you could probably have filled this entire podcast with your story, but I appreciate you condensing it for us. And one thing I found interesting in your journey was that it caused you to kind of dive into philosophy at a pretty young age. I know that you mentioned reading Sartre and Camus when you were just like around 14. It took me a little bit longer to get there, but
I remember I've often told this story. When I was in sixth grade, my parents had a book in the house called The World Religions, or The Religions of Man by Houston Smith. My mother was a lapsed Jew, my father a lapsed Catholic. And I said, what religion am I? And they said, anything you want to be. So I read the book when I was in sixth grade. And I often tell the story that having read the book, I decided I wanted to be a Buddhist, as did a lot of people my age eventually. Until I looked on TV and I saw the Buddhists immolating themselves on the streets of Saigon. And I thought to myself, nah, that's a little bit much for me. I don't know if I want to be a Buddhist. Turns out later that Houston Smith, when he wrote the book, was a Buddhist. So no surprise there. So I don't know why. I was a searching kid at a young age. I think the violence may have just made me a little more reflective, being thrown into positions that I had to reach inside myself much more deep. I'll just give you a little example. Mm-hmm. So I remember I was in my front lawn and I'm saying my Stingray bicycle, and a couple of really big guys came along. They told me to give them my bike. I said no, and they were stunned. So I put my elbow through my bike and I held on, and they were beating me. And I thought to myself, I'm not letting go. I don't care what they do. I'm not letting go of my bike. They can't have my bike. And they got tired. I was beaten up, and I said, I'm not letting go. So they looked around. I think people started to come out of their houses, so they took off. And I just remembered to myself, I'm not letting go. They're not stealing my bike today. And I think that I didn't know I had that in me. I can give you many stories like that, but it was a sense of, I don't even know where the capacity for it to go through that came from, nor the decision to go through it. Because I could let them have my bike. And, I think that thing that I discovered helped me through the Marine Corps boot camp. It certainly has kept me in Jiu-Jitsu for all these years. The other side of it, I think I had somewhat naturally. So I got my introduction to these things when my sister went to college, and then she went to Europe and left all her books behind. I just started reading all my sister's books from college. So she took a course in existentialism, and there I was sitting with The Plague and Nausea and all these other books. I just started reading. I just remember thinking to myself, I was in ninth grade, living in Linwood at the time. I just thought to myself, there's more things in the world than you would think from Linwood, California. It's a big world out there that we're not talking about. And that has stayed with me since reading those books.
Got it. And I guess that's a pretty good segue. So I actually just finished The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, who I know is one of your good friends. But I just heard of you because, my mom's Jewish, so I have some ties there. And I was like, oh, he started coming up in these podcasts, and I was like, I have a family. This sounds like an interesting person. And then the more I listened to you, I was very fascinated because I believe you are the only rabbi with a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is fascinating. Well,
if I'm not, I'm sure the other guy's going to find me. so far, nobody's called me out.
Yeah, he had to defend the crown. And then also, you have a very eclectic philosophy for being a rabbi. I think it's fair to say. I mean, I think you borrow
perhaps. I don't want to pigeonhole other rabbis.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's fair to say I have a broad outlook toward religion and philosophy without necessarily comparing myself to anybody else. But it's true. I think I have a broad interest and background.
Well, I guess that is fair to say, and not to pigeonhole anyone specifically, but, I grew up in a church, and to some degree, met a lot of pastors, and they had very similar views. And for one thing I found interesting to you is that you just explored so much in the schools of philosophy that I think that you've done the research. And it's something that I've tried to incorporate myself, but I certainly haven't done as much as you. What are some of maybe some of the philosophies that have really impacted your practice?
Well, so remember, I began with existentialism. Mm-hmm. And the idea that we are thrown into a cold and uncaring universe. We're not thrown in with divine providence. The universe doesn't really know that I'm here. If it does, it doesn't particularly care about me. And we have to make our lives and make meaning of our lives on our own. Now, I've since gone beyond that, but that sense of we have to build it ourselves. And so even when my family identified, we joined a synagogue. My mother's like you. My mother's Jewish. My dad wasn't. He ended up converting. But I never bought the religion. When they would say Moses on Mount Sinai, it never even occurred to me that anybody meant it literally. Mm-hmm. I think I know the difference between a myth and history. Myth meaning a narrative that orients your life that is not making a truth claim. I think I got that. No one even had to tell me that. So my deepest commitment was to existentialism. And then as I read more and more broadly, so, my high school curriculum was not the official curriculum, that's for sure. I would say going through high school, I was aware of Jung. I was aware of the nature of consciousness. I had read broadly in political theory and so forth. So when I finished high school, my question was, am I disciplined enough to play all this out in my life? I was going to be one of these kids who more or less went by emotion and couldn't focus myself enough. And so I went in the military in order to take all this knowledge I had and focus it into something. While I was overseas in the 3rd Marine Division in Okinawa, I went through the base library. A couple of really thoughtful friends took some college classes there. So when I came out of the military in 1976, I had a very strong sense I wanted to do something with all of this. And my question when I got out of the Marine Corps was what? So I already began with a very broad background in history and philosophy, mostly self-educated.
Where did that journey kind of take you? I can kind of see where it ended up, but I'm curious kind of the path to get to where you are look like.
Well, I having grown up in I'll call a leftist progressive home, the unstated premise is society is wrong, and therefore you fix the world through laws of changing society. Now, what I learned in the military was, if you want to go to an egalitarian culture, go into the military. Every private is the same as the next person, and every PFC is the same, and every Lance Corporal is the same. I really believe it was an equal opportunity environment. I don't think there was any, when I was in, I can almost guarantee you, there was no racism. It was competence. And everybody went through boot camp, knew exactly what was required of you. And I ended up being a court reporter, working in the legal section. And what astonished me was people with the exact same training and knowledge that I had broke the law. Now, it would never occur to me to go absent without leave, to disobey a direct order, to assault a non-commissioned officer. So I'm thinking I began watching this. I said, it's not that we don't have good, fair law, because the Uniform Code of Military Justice was equitably applied. Why weren't people snapping in? Why weren't they complying with what they knew? So I began to turn more toward virtue and the inner life, even kind of unconsciously. So when I got out of the military and I was taking a class in political science, I thought I was going to go into politics. And we studied the comparative constitution. I studied the Soviet Constitution, 1936, in which I found that Stalin had a constitution written that outlawed the death penalty. Here we have one of the greatest murderers in the history of humankind. So I asked my teacher, I said, how can it be, that this constitution that outlaws the death penalty, is the same country guilty of the arguably speaking, along with Imperial Japan, Communist China, and the Nazis, the most murder in all of humankind. And the teacher said something like, this is a class to compare political systems. We're not assessing the moral commitment to live up to, some ideal. And I said, well, who studies that? And the teacher, in a very offhand way, said, well, that's religion or something. And I went, I think I want to study that. So that was
Okay.
it. That started me on the road.
That's interesting. I'm always fascinated in religion myself because I mentioned my mom's Jewish, but she's like more of like her mom's Jewish type of thing. But my family was born, I was kind of raised in a Christian church. So definitely had a lot of that emphasis on ethics from an early age. And I think that does form a worldview that is consistently asking, like, what are the ethics of political systems or your internal life. I think this probably ties into what you just said, but you mentioned that you're not the guy that really discusses social justice because you want to aim at the human soul. So
Right.
I'm curious to learn a little bit more about what you meant by that, because if you're interested in exploring the human soul, it's a very big topic.
First of all, my doctorate is in religion, social ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trained in moral philosophy. I can probably talk ethics and moral philosophy better than most people who have a graduate degree in the topic. I'm very interested in ethics. In fact, I would say, unless you grow up in an Orthodox or evangelical home, most religion today that is not Orthodox or evangelical is focused on ethics. So Reform Judaism, conservative Judaism, etc. Not to say that the others aren't focused in ethics, but you might say for the non-Orthodox, non-fundamentalist, ethics almost takes the place of religion. Like religion serves ethics instead of ethics serving religion.
That's interesting.
So I grew up in a home that was extremely devoted to social ethics. I have a graduate degree. I think I understand political and economic and ethical and social issues very well. But here's one thing I began to see as a rabbi in Southern California. I saw political hatred. So I would see the left and the right hating each other and neither wanting to say, well, wait a minute, what are the facts? What are the theories? Where do we agree? Where do we disagree? How can we engage with each other and find truth? Now, it's interesting in the Talmud, one of our great texts upon which we rely for all kinds of instruction, there are two great rabbinic schools of thought, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And they differ on many issues in law. And so the question gets asked, if it all goes back to Mount Sinai, how can you have two different legal schools of thought deciding many issues in different ways? So the question was asked, whom does God prefer, the teachings of Hillel or the teachings of Shammai? So here's the answer. It says God prefers the teachings of Hillel. Why? Because when Hillel teaches, he teaches the teachings of Shammai first, which means he knows what the other person's argument is and teaches it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And doesn't defame anybody, and because of their comportment. So in this fascinating Talmudic state, God says, I don't have a preference which school of law. You guys figure that out. I'll tell you who I like better. and I like the people who present their interlocutor's argument first and fairly and comport themselves well. So when I would meet a fellow Jew who really, didn't like some other political program, I would say, well, what about Hillel and Shammai? They said, well, I have my reasons. And so I found all across the political spectrum, people committed to ethics, except the ethic of civility.
Yeah, I buy that.
Okay, so I decided very early on. I mean, look, I research things well, and I can probably back up my political opinions with a lot of, solid facts and theory. I don't want to do it because the main thing I want to do is teach civility. So if someone comes up to me and says, hey, Rabbi, what do you think about such and such? I would say, well, what are your premises? What are your axioms? No, I just want to know what you think. Yes, yeah, but I don't want to talk about what I think. I want us to think together. See, I could start out with what I think, and then I'll just lose the person thinking differently from me. But if I say, let's discuss our premises, let's discuss our axioms, let's discuss our facts as we know them. Let's ask ourselves which policies line up with which theories and which facts and which axioms. And you have a discussion like that. Then two people, in a way, you have a meeting of the minds and the souls and the heart, instead of just polarizing against each other. So when I'm asked, well, what do you think about this thing? I say to myself, if I announce my position, I've already lost 50% of America.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to discuss something with somebody, one thing I need to know first, Johnny, I have to know the other person actually knows how to talk.
Yeah.
Because many people know how to opine. They know how to give their opinions, but most people are not trained. And I don't mean this as an insult. I just want to say it's the nature of our education system. Most people are not trained how to be rational.
So there's a lot of questions I could ask around, how is one to be rational? And I suppose I would like to ask that question, but you raise a really interesting point. And I like the idea of trying to teach civility. I don't think the polarity has been nearly this bad since I've been alive. I mean, I don't remember ever being this bad. And it kind of reminds me of, I believe it was the ancient Greeks, when they would have arguments, the first thing they did was establish terms, where they say, what is the premise of the argument? What are we even arguing about?
Yeah, that's Socrates. Socrates is a great model. But remember, they killed him, don't forget.
That's true. Yeah.
That's the Socrates Plato tradition. What are we talking about here? Exactly right.
Right. So I guess a good question would be, how do you teach civility? And then how does that really manifest itself in terms of being rational? Because I think it's so easy to get emotional. I think our first instinct is often to be emotional. And then also, I think it's hard to detach ourselves from whatever ideology we subscribe to. So for instance, like if it's a political argument, if you identify with Democrat or if you identify as Republican or whatever you identify with, I feel like it's very difficult to get people to detach from that in order to even hear what you're saying.
That's correct. People is tribal.
Right.
So when one announces Democrat, Republican, whatever, they're put into a tribal slot. The other person says, "Oh, you're from that tribe, and my tribe hates your tribe. Mm-hmm. So let's just get to the verbal abuse." And so, a civil person starts with, I think, and this takes some training, Johnny, mm-hmm. a basic, deep respect for other human beings that doesn't come natural to us when we're dealing with the other tribe. Now, we respect people in our own tribe, typically, but the minute we hear someone's from another tribe, the instinct is not to accord them respect. That's just part of human evolution. The other tribe might try to kill us and eat us. So if they're from the other tribe, we better ready to fight. Now we live in a modern liberal society. So if I hear a point of view that I don't like, and I hear many people say, in my mind, unsupportable, poorly thought out points of view. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe they have some facts I haven't discovered yet. And maybe there's a coherence that I'm not seeing. So the first I think to myself is, wow, it's interesting. Can you tell me more about it? Now, that's my training. It doesn't matter what I feel. There's another human being in front of me. And their whole life story brought them to this moment where they think this. Now, if their theories are not good, something in their life guided them toward rooting their lives in unsound theories. I'd like to know what happened there. Or a person cherry picks facts in a certain way. Again, I'd like to know what happened there. So civility starts with, I respect you as a human being. My goal in life is not to talk you out of positions that you've taken a lifetime for me. Okay, that's how much I respect you, that you haven't invited me to change you, and until I get the invitation, I'm overstepping my bounds. If you'd like to, I'd like to hear about what you have to say. And so it's a rehearsed attitude. And like any virtue training, you rehearse enough and it becomes part of your character. I really don't argue with anybody. I just don't. I mean, if someone wants to know what I think, I would say, "Are you sure you want to know what I think?" Yeah. I say, "I'd much rather talk." No, I just want to know what you think. I say, "I would think." Well, that's horrible. I say, "Okay, it's horrible." All right.
No, I love that kind of methodology for having those conversations, because it's like you said, it takes practice. That's not a natural instinct for a lot of us, is to really step back.
Listen, and ask for more information. The discipline of what is your premise? What is your axiom? And remember, premises and axioms are not rational. They're axiomatic. It's a starting place. So a person has a starting place. I got to find out what that is. Now, for many people, they confuse an axiom with a conclusion. Let's say someone says, with this whole thing here, how dare America criticize Russia? Aren't we the most violent country? And I'll say, I think that's a conclusion, not an axiom. Because if you're saying we're the most violent country, that sounds like you got some facts on your mind. So why don't you tell me what you're talking about? And they say, well, we invaded Afghanistan. I say, yeah, so what happened right before we invaded Afghanistan? Oh yeah, 9/11. It's probably important to put that in there. Like, we just didn't wake up one day and invade Afghanistan. Something actually happened. I'm not for it or against it, defending it or attacking it. I just want to have a factual conversation. So here's what I find. Simply say, I never really thought about that. Let's talk about the facts of what's happened in the past 50 years. and all the context and all the things going on and see if we can come to a conclusion. Now, I'd much prefer to have that conversation rather than just start with a conclusion and never figure out how we got there. So anytime someone says something to me, you're going to probably hear me say, wait, is that an axiom or a conclusion? If it's a conclusion, let's work back to the axiom and fill in with a little bit of facts and theories and then get to a conclusion. So it's axioms and premises, then facts and theories, then conclusions. That's a basic, let's say rationality 101. Axioms and premises, facts and theories, conclusions.
I like that. It's brilliant. I wish they would teach that in schools.
I know.
Have a rationality class. That'd be awesome.
The whole world would be better.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm curious though to ask you about Jiu-Jitsu, because I know that you practice and I feel like there are some correlations there, just in terms of.
There might be.
Yeah, well, just in terms of practice, right? Because I think you put it this way: I've done very little martial arts, but enough to know. So I did wrestling, judo, did some boxing, and oftentimes the first instinct is not the actual appropriate response. Mm-hmm. And also, I feel like oftentimes it's like you think you know how to do something, but the reality is once you see somebody who actually knows what you're doing, you're like, wow, I really had no clue what I was doing. Yeah. Do you feel like maybe there is some correlation there where oftentimes the first response is not the appropriate response or maybe not the most rational response? And how do you practice finding axioms rather than basing arguments on conclusions? Yeah.
Well, let's start with, so first of all, I clearly got interested in martial arts because I like to fight. So that's right. I did karate and boxing, all kinds of stuff when I was in the military. I turned to jiu-jitsu because I, like many people, saw the UFC and I saw the Gracies wipe out the competition. And I said, I got to know that. So I turned to jiu-jitsu at age 45. I'd been doing karate for 20 years. When I was in jiu-jitsu and really in, and I made it to my blue belt, which means you try to erase all the white belt instincts. That's when I began to notice the similarities between what I call virtue training and jiu-jitsu. And it goes like this. When a person realizes that they're being angry, defensive, judgmental is not good for a relationship. Let's say it comes out, they come and say, well, my wife, husband does this. I say, that's clearly annoying. Yes. So you explain to me how you're criticizing, complaining, and condemning makes it better. I'm all ears. What's your theory? Well, I don't have a theory. It's just how I feel. I said, let's start there. You're saying what you feel and what you say makes it worse. Yes. Therefore, we conclude expressing feelings when you're in an agitated state makes things worse, not better. May we conclude this? Okay, fine. I said, okay, so let's go back. So there is no good reason to express negative feelings when you're upset with somebody, produce no good. Yes. So I need to stop. Well, how do I stop? I said, it's a sincere question if you're willing to learn, because I can tell you how to stop. And so I would work with a person, and what I realized is they actually hadn't decided to stop. When they say, how do I stop? It was not a sincere question. Okay, now what is this like? If you take, let's say a little bit of judo, okay? Mm-hmm. So you link up in judo, right? Collar sleeve, right? And you start to push the guy. And you suddenly, someone throws out an ippon seonagi and you're on your back.
Yeah.
Right? And the coach says, don't push on people because they'll switch around and throw you. Yeah, okay. And then someone grabs you and you push, but you land on your back like 10 times. Mm-hmm. And then you realize, so when someone pushes me, don't push back, move to the side. Because every time I push back, I get thrown. Okay? Mm-hmm. So there are what we call white belt mistakes. When someone does this, my automatic trigger says do this, and then something bad happens. Okay, that's jiu-jitsu. You're on top of somebody, they push up their arms, they're going to get arm locked or wrist locked or something, right? So I'm on top of a white belt, they push, I said, please don't do that because I will now arm lock you. I'd like to think of something else. I said, well, what do? I say, well, when I'm heavy on your chest, move your hips. Okay. Now, how long does it take a white belt to remember that when someone's heavy on your chest, move your hips? About 6 months to really where it becomes part of muscle memory. That's called working through your white belt. Now let's go to interpersonal relationships. The spouse, the child, the parent is pressing on you. Many people want to push back instead of move your hips. Right? Mom, what just happened? Can you explain to me what I did wrong? right? You just start asking questions. Now, the more you ask factual questions, it calms people down. If you start with no, I didn't, yes, you did, no, I didn't, it just escalates. That's a white belt move. Why didn't you clean up your room? Mom, what happened? Well, I came in here, your room's not clean. Yeah, but you told me to clean up by 5 o'clock. Well, what time is it? It's 4:30. Was there anything you should get going? Yeah, but it's not 5 o'clock yet. Okay, I'll come back at 5. Thank you. Right. You don't have to push back against an upset parent. You can sidestep. Mm-hmm. So I taught classes for teenagers how to manage your parents. because parents get upset, and what do kids do? They get in their faces and things get worse. All right. So what I began to notice as I got better in jiu-jitsu, I got my blue belt in 2003. And then I was at the same time doing this virtue counseling. I started to sharpen at the same time. I would say they had something of a symbiotic effect on each other. As I understood jiu-jitsu as a series of triggers and responses, and I understood interpersonal communication as a series of triggers and responses, the metaphors began to sink into each other. And there's probably not a week goes by that I don't teach virtue and rationality and wisdom without using a jiu-jitsu metaphor.
Well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So not only because you know that's your experience and you probably know how to articulate it very well, but also there's just so many correlations because martial arts are very primal and it's a lot of responding. So that makes a lot of sense. And I know that you do have a counseling practice where you help people work on their interpersonal relationships with each other. So I'm curious to hear from you, what are some of maybe the most common misconceptions people have that limit their ability to emotionally connect with each other?
Yeah, the greatest fallacy is talking. Okay, so the secret to a good marriage is lack of communication, which means talk less, especially when you're distraught. When you're distraught, I teach people, breathe, don't talk, go to a script. Don't talk about how you feel when you're distraught, because it's probably going to either hurt the other person or just not be helpful. So the idea, we have this fallacy since the 70s, I think, that expressing is good. Yeah, expressing to your therapist is good. But you're not married to your therapist, I hope, right? And that ends in exactly 50 minutes, right? And then I'll see you in a week. Now, if someone sat with me and didn't leave the room and they started talking bad to me, at a certain point I say, you have to stop and leave the room, right? I mean, no therapist is going to take that for very long. Like a person going through a transference. You remind me of my mother, my father. I look at my watch and I say, I got exactly 10 more minutes of this, and then they're out of here, right?
Right.
Even so, I'm not into this idea of, trying to create transfers with somebody. I'm really much more of a spiritual coach, spiritual guide. But when you think about it, no human being is really built to take criticizing and condemnation and criticism for very long before they need either attack back or defend themselves. Okay. So I will say to people, I call it the virtue practice, which is commit yourself as much as possible. No criticizing, no complaining, no condemning, no escalating conflict. If any of that comes up, don't talk, take a breath, go to a script. On the other side, if someone's upset with me, right, and I realize that my instincts are to justify myself, explain myself, defend myself, deny that it happened, try to give him more information. JEDDI, I call that the bad Jedi. If someone's pressing in on me, I might try a couple times and say, no bad Jedi. I just got to go to a script. So what are the scripts like? If I'm upset with somebody, I can say, I'm really frustrated right now. I don't want to talk. I'm really frustrated and I'm in a bad place. So give me a couple of minutes and I'm going to get myself together. If someone's upset with me, I'll say, you're being hurtful. So I need to wrap this up. So there are all kinds of, I call de-escalation scripts. So when I teach my classes on Wednesday nights, every single night I give people, I do my teaching, people present cases, pretty vulnerable, impressive people, by the way. And then I run through the basic program. I call this the virtue practice. Don't talk, take a breath, go to script. And I offer people de-escalation scripts. So it's amazing. I'm going to share you something. There's a woman calls in and she says, I've had conflict with my daughter for 10 years. She was like 15, now she's 25, still lives at home, and we fight all the time. And so I said, what happens? Well, my daughter starts criticizing me. Just say to her, well, this is not really working out for me right now. I'll get back to you. I said, that's it. Well, what about, I said, don't what about me? just for the next week, every time your daughter says something harsh, say, wow, that's really hurtful. This is not working for me right now. I'll talk to you later. So the woman reports back the next week. First, the daughter said, like, are you in some kind of cult or something? Like, what happened to you? Where's my mother? Right.
Yeah.
And so, and the woman says the conflict dropped 90%. And then she's the most infuriating thing happened. My daughter started doing the same thing. The brother would say, why is your laundry not done? Mom, this is a little bit hurtful. It's not working for me right now. And just walk out. And she said, wow, it's just like, we don't fight. Like the laundry's not done, but at least we don't fight, you know?
Yeah.
And so I teach these things, and Johnny, as people drill, this is like the very basic white belt move, but they really drill this stuff, everything gets better. Because when you get out all the noise of the anger and the criticizing and the defensiveness, you can start to figure out what happened and then get to the real thing. But you can't get to the real thing without all of this destructive noise that happens in a lot of interpersonal relationships that are going through a tough time.
Oh, I think that that might be my favorite. One of my favorite quotes is the secret to happy marriage is a lack of communication.
Yeah, I didn't make that up. As I was teaching this somewhere, some old guy says, Rabbi Finley, this reminds me what my father used to say. And I said, okay, I'm using that forever.
Yeah, that's a great one. I'm going to borrow it from you.
Yeah,
I might take credit for it.
I borrowed it, so you're welcome to
it. That's really useful. I like the idea of having scripts, especially because like when you're angry in a situation, like you just want to respond with whatever you're feeling. But the idea of it's like you said, like having the training to be able to go to the script is so useful because it's like it de-escalates the situation as soon as
absolutely. And look how that relates to martial arts.
Yeah.
When you're new at it, you don't do what you feel. You go to your script.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, I don't know how to say it. Like if I'm going to throw a right cross, I still keep my hand up because I could miss, right? And I bounce back. So like you have to learn when I do this, always do this as well. I got to cover up. So when you look at these Hollywood fights where someone always throws that big right cross, somebody bounces out of the way and smacks them, like all the bad guys throw terrible right crosses. If you do it, right?
Yeah.
None of them know how to fight. And I'm looking at that and I say, when is the stunt coordinator going to let bad guys have a fighting chance for once, and not throw that horrible right cross and then they get a left hook smashed into them. So anyway, so what you learn is whatever you're going to do, you do it consciously. And ideally, when you master the no criticizing, no bad Jedi, no one throwing punches, right? Everybody's just de-escalating. And if, you have a couple people that know how to, wow, here's my emotions. I'm not going to talk till I'm calm. I'm just going to de-escalate. Things in a home, parents and children, spouses, friends, things can just get so much better. Not that things are going to work, but you can get to work. You can get to the deeper thing instead of always dealing with the noise.
I love that. I wanted to run something by you. It's semi-related, but the idea of practicing. So I unfortunately I don't have somebody like you in my life who is really teaching me how to deal with these things. But I do a lot of reading myself, and I probably read. You've read, I'm sure, like hundreds of more books than me. But I do read a lot of philosophy myself. And when I was really in the midst of my anxiety and my depression, there's two books that really stuck out to me. I've talked about them here on the podcast before: Meditations and Man's Search for Meaning. And what I constructed in my head, and I would love to get your feedback on this, is in order to manage my internal anxiety, I kind of rely on stoicism. So when I'm dealing with Johnny versus Johnny, it's like the stoicism, the idea of practicing, okay, if I'm upset, don't deal with it and have an emotional response to it. And really just trying to focus on what I can control. And then when it comes to dealing with other people, I like a more Eastern type of philosophy, more Christian philosophy, maybe, where it's, love your neighbor and trying to treat everyone with empathy and compassion. And then with career stuff, I feel like I kind of borrow a little bit from maybe Machiavelli or Nietzsche, or, careers are oftentimes it's a bit of a power game. So I think it's important to understand power, but I'm curious to maybe just hear some of your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, let's think about it in a little bit of an organized way.
Yes.
So first of all,
love that.
Emotions and feelings comprise close relationships. You're with people because you love them. Because you have strong feelings, and with love, the desire to be around somebody, comes a sense of trust and vulnerability. and then it gets defeated. So we feel unseen, unheard, unappreciated, and we get upset. We either get angry, depressed, or anxious or something. So it's always well to remember, emotions are good as long as they're good. Looking forward to going to work, loving your work, excited about your team, all these things are great. And that's what makes life worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be vigilant for is when an emotion goes bad. And that takes a practice where you're able to identify, train yourself to know when a thought, feeling, or emotion is going bad. Bad meaning doesn't increase your well-being and does not increase your well-being with other people. Now, I'm saying this very quickly, but I mean it very deeply. I train myself to feel in my body, because it happens in your body before anywhere else. When I have a thought, feeling, or emotion that's not accruing to my well-being or the well-being of me and other people or the well-being of another person, you train yourself enough, you feel it. When you feel it, the first thing you do is don't talk. So it doesn't get out and suddenly you lash out at other people. You try to memorize the moment and then take a moment to reflect. Now, you have to reflect on what was the trigger. So when you have a moment to reflect, if you're feeling anxious, angry, whatever it is, there was a trigger. And you have to identify the trigger, because remember, from an evolutionary perspective, we human beings are vigilant for threat. So anxiety usually means undifferentiated threat. Now, fear is a specific threat. Anxiety is undifferentiated threat. Something not happening here, right? Something bad's going on. I don't even know what it is. We'll call that anxiety for now.
Sure.
So what I try to do is I try to turn anxiety into fear. Anxiety from a generalized threat to a specific threat. What exactly am I afraid of? So people say to me, Rabbi Finley, I'm anxious. I say, okay, tell me about their anxiety. I said, I want you to pick one thing to be afraid of. Well, there are so many things. I pick one. I don't know which one to pick. See, already I'm getting resistance.
Yeah.
I say, pick one thing. And typically the thing they pick next is the thing that they're anxious about, but they don't want to admit it to themselves. I'm afraid I'm going to die alone. I'm afraid I'll never find love. I'm afraid no one's ever going to love me. Okay. And it makes me feel horrible about my life. I say, okay, well, let's focus on that. Okay. That's a fear we can work with. So for example, anxiety, typically 70% of the time, I try to get anxiety into fear and to articulate the fear as precisely as possible. And you know what I find, Johnny? Sometimes people are afraid to announce the fear because it is so terrible. It creates such grief. It creates such, inner upset that they were better off being anxious, as it were, because they didn't have to face the fear. Now, from a Stoic perspective, remember, you face a rational fear. Remember, Stoicism is rooted in rationality, not just resilience. You see, resilience without rationality is just stubbornness.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have to have a rational base. So when someone says, I'm afraid of such and such, I would have to then talk about the rationality of the fear. Is something possible or likely? How likely? In how long? What kind of damage is it going to do? Do you have the resources to deal with it? So whenever a person mentions their fear or anxiety, I spend a lot of time on putting, understanding fear in a rational way. And then once you have a rational understanding, what is this? How likely? How possible? Under what circumstances? What will be my response? What are my resources, personal and otherwise? What am I going to do next? When you have all that set, the Stoicism has to do with living with what you processed and not going back and doing the math all over again. So if I've decided I'm going to strike a certain path, after all this cogitation, I'm going to stick with that. So always remember, at least according to my opinion, Stoicism is a result of rationality. In fact, the Stoics' greatest contribution to Western thought is their logic, not their resilience.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a good way to look at Stoicism too. As someone who I think has really tried practicing it for about 5 or 6 years now and really dedicated a lot of my inner life to it. That adds so much to it, just thinking of it in those terms. I think a lot of people do focus on the resiliency of Stoicism, but I do like thinking of it as being rational logic, especially because I think the Western mind is so attuned to being logical and rationality over everything else.
Yeah, and so are others. By the way, when you start looking in the Eastern traditions, I'm most familiar with the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition. They also have great schools of rationality. Great schools, they call it the mind yoga, Raja Yoga. Mm-hmm. How to think well, Patanjali in the Hindu tradition. So this is everywhere. Every tradition includes how to think well. And then once you think well and you come to your conclusion, right, then you want to proceed forward, not be thrown off because of somebody else's opinion. Who's really great at this is, not people don't look at him much anymore, is Francis Bacon. He was very big on thinking well and then acting on good, proper thinking. So the Stoics made great strides in going beyond Aristotle's, syllogism. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. Socrates is more or less the basic syllogistic thinking. They thought like that was all of logic, and then the Stoics went on and really expanded that into all kinds of great. We could do like logic games, and you will realize how sophisticated the mind is in figuring things out. So all the Stoics really did was give us articulate the software of the human mind. But in any case, I'm just going back to that statement I made earlier. Know how to think well. And then what you come up with, if it's reliable, stay with it. So that's for me the essence of Stoicism, not just thinking any old thing and then being stubborn about it.
I know that you dealt a lot with ego. You talk about ego a lot, and there's a difference between ego and the ego self. And I was hoping you could maybe expand on what you meant by that, because when you first explained it, I was a little bit confused, and I would just love to know a little bit more.
So here's the problem. When a person says, my ego got in my way, they usually mean some kind of narcissistic self-assertion.
Yeah.
But what about the person who chronically needs approval? The person who's always self-effacing, the pleaser. Does their ego get in their way?
Yeah, sure. Right.
Okay, so therefore we can't use the word ego as in narcissistic self-assertion. Because for the approval-seeking person, it's non-assertion.
Right.
So I don't use the word ego in the sense of narcissistic assertion. Like my ego got in my way and I didn't listen to my wife or husband. I say, let's call all of it the unconscious ego self. All of it. For some people, it's avoidance. For some people, it's domination. Some people, it's confusion. Some people, it's aggression. Some people, it's victimhood. So I don't know what aspect is getting in your way until I figure it out. But I don't want to confuse ego with only one destructive ego state. I would rather admit there are probably 20 different ego, subconscious, unconscious ego states, and any of them can get in your way. So I don't use the word ego. I use the term unconscious ego self to mean the area of the inner life where all your ego states exist. Some ego states are positive, some ego states are negative, and we want to be conscious of and vigilant about our unconscious negative ego states. Unconscious ego self refers to the array of unconscious ego states.
Got it.
So I use it in a very technical way.
Got it. And I suppose that makes a lot of sense, though, because I think the natural thought process is that ego is pride, right? Where it is that narcissistic tendency of being, taking things personally when they don't need to be taken personally. Yeah. Or
I'd rather just call that pride.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that is pride, isn't it? Yeah. So maybe what are some of the tools that you use to help people identify their unconscious ego? What was it? Unconscious ego state. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. So the first thing is you'll notice either discomfort in yourself, discomfort in another person, an uneasy situation. This is where you have a daily practice. And I really say to people, you have to have a daily practice where you contemplate what's happened, what's likely to happen, what's going to happen today, with what people, what situations, how do I normally respond? And it takes a few months to develop the vocabulary. I carry resentment. I carry guilt. I carry shame. I carry envy. I carry victimhood. I carry aggression. I carry narcissism. Whatever it is, you start to identify it, and people say, well, I don't know how to name these things. And I say, it takes training. It takes training every day to sit there. And I go to what's called the observer mind, and you observe the various things going on. Okay. So if you take a look at your life, in the morning, you sit there and you actually try to observe what's happening in the field of consciousness. And I might be neutral, and you start thinking about the day before. Well, that made me feel really good. I was really positive. I really enjoyed that. But that didn't make me feel so good. And I'm feeling overwhelmed, and I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling anxious. Just name those ego states: frustration, anxiety, fear, guilt, shame. After a while, you name them. So the first thing is naming. Now, as you name, the next step, in this observer mind, no judging. Don't say, I'm anxious and it's bad, or I'm fearful and it's bad. There's no bad or good when you're observing. It's very important to train yourself to observe the ego state in the unconscious ego self without judgment. Just let them be. Just bring the light of consciousness upon them. And once they realize that they're being brought into the light, they're now out of the darkness of the unconscious ego self, they will want to open up. So for example, let's say fear. So now this is where we have an interesting phenomenon of the higher self talking to an ego state. Now this does take some training. It's called self-talk, but it's not really I'm talking to myself. My higher self is talking to my ego self. So here's a classic example. I was angry with somebody. Okay, I can feel the anger. And let's say I followed my practice, I didn't speak it, I restrained it, and now I'm going to work on it. I look at the anger. All anger is more or less a frustrated need, almost all. Someone didn't do what I wanted them to do. Someone didn't meet a need of mine, an expectation, an entitlement, a demand. Something happened where my bodily response was frustration and anger. So I might ask, what exactly was my need, expectation, entitlement, or demand? So this is now using my objective mind. Objectively speaking, what exactly was my need? Now, when I ask myself what my need was, I'm going off from what they did, which is mesmerizing, to what my need was. Okay. Mm-hmm. So when I look at what my need was, I've already stopped thinking about the other person. Anger goes down 90%. So let's say, common one with teenagers, that the teenager greets me in the morning, says goodnight at night, and kind of lets me know what their day's like. And I feel dissed as a parent because they don't just, have the common courtesy, say, good morning, good evening, I'm going here, I'm going there. Okay. So that's my need. Now I ask myself, is my need moral? Yeah, kind of like just let's all be civil and have good etiquette. Yeah, it's nothing immoral about it. Next question. First one is moral. Is my need rational? Then I ask myself, okay, let's ask some rational questions. What are teenagers like?
Yeah. By
definition, they don't follow etiquette because teenagers, by definition, from a child development from a developmental psychology, they're trying to get themselves kicked out of the house because they're not supposed to stay forever.
Right.
Okay. So something in a well-developed teenager will say, I can't stand you. That's what they're supposed to say. I mean, otherwise, as Daniel Siegel said, who doesn't want to wake up to milk and cookies every morning? You have to say that your autonomy is more important than milk and cookies.
Yeah.
Okay, so teenagers don't understand that they're working on, an evolutionary desire to strike out on their own. They're not supposed to be living under another adult when they're 15, 16. This is an abnormal thing we have going on here, where kids stay inside the parents' cave after 15. They're supposed to find a cave around the corner, not stay in their parents' cave after 15, right?
Right.
Okay, but here we are. So you step back and say, oh, they're individuating. Cool. They're kind of showing this natural, I don't like mom and dad so much, or I like mom more than dad, or dad more than mom, or something.
Yeah.
But see, any parent who's upset with a teenager for being a teenager is being irrational.
Got it.
So therefore, what is my real need? How do I parent a teenager well? Not how do I get my teenagers to comply with all the rules of etiquette when they are going through a developmental process of individuating. If I rationally don't want them to do that, that's the worst thing for my teenager, is not to want them to go through adolescence. I want them to go through adolescence well. Now I have a new need. How do I properly parent an adolescent? I'm no longer angry at the kid. I put a challenge before myself. So I want you to look at this. I'm angry with my kid because they don't greet me in the morning. That is not a rational need. They're going through this adolescent individuation thing. A better need is to be a good parent of a teenager and guide them through this painful journey called adolescence. The anger goes away completely. And now I've committed myself to virtue. Now I'm compressing what 3 sessions of counseling look like for parents of an adolescent, but it goes just like this in 100 different ways.
That makes a lot of sense. And I love how you've laid out kind of the way that you can get there in your mind, because I think that just telling somebody, just don't take it personally is right, not really doing it justice. But that is kind of the way that I've always, I've tried to, incorporate it in my head, is just to just ask, okay, well, I'm upset at this person for doing this thing to me, but is it possible that it wasn't personal and it had nothing to do with me and it had everything to do with A, B, and C? And I think that has helped me to not get my emotions hurt.
And just to put a little more precise shine on it, what was my need? My need was for them not to have a bad day.
Right.
So that's a little more specific. And therefore, it wasn't about me. It was about their state of not having a good day. Now, I would then go a step further, Johnny, and say, what do I need of myself to be present to somebody not having a good day? See, I always take an irrational need and add onto it a virtue obligation. What do I do when someone else is not having a good day? So first of all, I excuse and forgive them, but then I add to myself, is there anything I can do?
I like that. Yeah, that's a pretty good system. What is something that bothers you about the world that we live in today? And this could be spiritually, mentally, existentially. And what do you see as being a solution to that problem?
Yeah. I think the thing that bothers me the most is people have no historical perspective. So when people say this is the worst ever, because, I haven't studied history. So I go back to 1942. Okay, 1942, Imperial Japan had conquered most of Southeast Asia, Philippines, Guam, Saipan, and were engaged in the most repressive, China especially, the most repressive, murderous regime imaginable. They probably were directly responsible to the deaths of 20 to 30 million people. Okay, mostly in China, but also other places. The Germans had invaded the Soviet Union, got pushed to the gates of Moscow and stopped. But during the German occupation of Poland, Ukraine, Union, again, they killed, murdered millions and millions and millions of people. You look what happened in the Soviet Union before World War II, where Stalin had starved out millions of Ukrainians. Okay, Mao probably killed 30 million of his own people. Okay, so people say to me, it's never been this bad. I'll say, okay, I want you to take a deep breath and go look up 1942. And you compare 2022 to 1942, and you tell me how bad it is. Because we didn't know we were going to win World War II in 1942. In fact, most people put their money on the Germans and the Japanese. And if they had won the war, and they could have won the war, by the way, they could have won that war had they not made some terrible mistakes, the world would be very different. And the only reason the world is different now, because people just like you and me made incredible sacrifices. Once in a millennium kinds of sacrifices to push back the Japanese and to push back the Germans and eventually face down the Russians. Okay, it took a long time to do it, but eventually the Soviet Union collapsed, which is why we are where we are now with the Russian and the Ukraine. But see, this is based on the fact that we pushed the Soviet Union into a corner. The Soviet Union collapsed because it really was an evil empire. People don't want to know this. So I think if people actually studied history, the history of their people. Okay, I go back, my dad is Irish. I said the history of the Irish people, the potato famine, millions of Irish intensely starved by the English. That's why my family is Jewish. Okay, most of my mother's family wiped out in the Holocaust. Okay. I'm sure if we dig into your history a little bit, you come from some pretty tough people who have suffered greatly, whatever family tree you go down.
Mhm.
Now go down to 2022. This is about the best it's ever been. And it's bad now, right? We are in the top 1% of the 99% of world history right now.
Mhm.
So first of all, let's all just take a deep breath.
Yeah.
Okay. We're talking about microaggressions.
Yeah.
So the main thing is, Johnny, people don't know any history.
No, I agree with you in terms of us living in the best timeline possible, because when you look back at something like 1942 and you look at the Great Leap Forward, the Bolshevik Revolution, and it's basically everything that was happening in that part of the world. I mean, it's easy to see that we're pretty lucky here. I mean, you get hungry for lunch, you just order Postmates to come deliver it to you.
You know, Postmates overcharges. Yeah, that's way better than starving. So
exactly.
There's that. Yeah,
exactly. So that's good. It's good to have that perspective, and I think that's like that kind of gets lost in history, because history oftentimes I feel like is, we study how power has transferred through time. I think that's what history is, and it's easy to kind of just get lost in maybe some of the problems that.
Well, here's what it is. Here's what it is, Johnny. People's emotions are the same, even though circumstances had differed. So I want to say something that I've noticed back when Bush was president. So Bush was a Nazi, according to many people. Mm-hmm. And I taught Holocaust for 10 years. Mm-hmm. I would say, do you know what a Nazi is? Like, do you know how hard Nazis had to work to get the word Nazi associated with genocide? So I said, however bad Bush is, like he hasn't even come like to the soles of the feet of a real Nazi. Yeah. So let's use a different word. What's a different word from Nazi? And then it turns out that Obama was a Nazi. I said, whoa. Okay, well, Obama's a Marxist. I said, no, he's a Democrat, guys. This all just like bring the rhetoric down. So what I notice is when people have strong emotions, they look for the strongest word.
Yeah, definitely.
Instead of what's the most rational word. So now we're back to where we began. If people thought rationally, they would use their words more carefully, and then we could actually solve some problems. So one reason people think everything's bad is they're using old words for problems that actually no longer exist. So this is for me the advantage of rational thinking is you're able to clarify what exactly is wrong under what conditions, exactly how do we make it better.
Yeah. And that's hard because rhetoric is so popular these days. It's really hard to be able to run a campaign on rational thinking. But
exactly.
If you ever decide to go that route, I'll vote for you.
The campaign slogan is "Let's all hesitate and think clearly." Yeah, it's not going to get a lot of votes.
Yeah, it'd be hard to put that on a bumper sticker for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I had one last question for you,
okay.
And that would just be, if you could give a younger version of yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
Don't take myself so seriously. Lighten up.
Okay, I like that too. That's certainly something I had to learn too, and it's kind of helped me put like a sense of humor to things that shouldn't be funny. Like it's kind of the reason. It's like the podcast. Like we're all gonna die.
Yeah, light touch. I think I could have maybe lived life a little more mindfully and efficiently if I didn't take things so seriously. I would have had a little more perspective, a little more kindness to myself, kind to other people. Look, there are many things I can say, but you asked for like an immediate answer.
Yeah.
At a specific age. One thing that age has done for me is definitely a lighter touch. It's like Jiu-Jitsu, you're calm, it's all angles, super light, mm-hmm. you get what you need from minimum effort.
I like it. Rabbi Finley, this has been an honor. I'm so glad we had this conversation.
Thank you for reaching out to me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm so happy that you said yes. It was, it came at a really perfect time. I just listened to one of your podcasts, just read The War of Art, and I knew that you had such a big role to play in that book. So this has been awesome for me. You give me some really interesting ways to think about it. So I really appreciate you for that.
Outstanding.
Once again, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to Google Rabbi Finley. He's got a website at rabbifinley.com where you can sign up for any number of counseling sessions. He does couples counseling, teenage counseling, individual counseling. Pick your poison. He's got it up there. I'd also suggest that you check out a few of his other interviews, as he is a highly sought after guest for reasons that I believe this podcast has made apparent. The next episode will be out in 2 weeks. If you want to stay in the loop, feel free to follow me at Here's Johnny Nava on either YouTube or Instagram. Have an amazing, amazing week ahead of you, and I look forward to having you back some other time. Cheers.